I know I said we were going to start our first process, but we do have to go through just a few more items before we can get started with our hands-on activity. There's just some key concepts and terms that I want to review with you before we move forward. I've used this term a few times now, BPS or BizFlow Process Studio. And again, this is the desktop studio tool that facilitates both design time modeling and runtime execution management. And what I mean by that is if we just jump over to our studio, we have an area when we log in to a server, and again, we'll talk more about these details later, where we have projects and also an operation environment. And so what I mean by design time, this is where we're building out our various process flows and forms and doing all of the design time work. And then we also have an operation area where we can manage the runtime processes. So once users begin to start to interact with those processes, then we can actually track and manage and monitor them from this studio in the same way that we could through the web client. The Process Modeler, as you saw, is a tool that gets launched from the Business Process Studio. So from within the studio, you can launch the Process Modeler tool, and that's the tool we use to drag and drop and create our flowcharts and BizFlow processes. BPMN, if you remember, I showed you in the Process Modeler a palette of activity icons. And BPMN the acronym stands for Business Process Model and Notation, to be technically accurate. And it's a modeling language. Before BPMN came into being, the various process mapping and modeling tools use different methods or different icons to represent the same things. So one modeling tool might have used a circle to represent the starting point of a process, and another might have used a triangle. And so this was very confusing, especially if you were going from one company to another or one tool to another. There was no continuity in what a given icon in the map meant. So what BPMN does is it creates a standard language so that no matter what tool you use, if you learn how to model in BPMN, you can read any model that's done in any business process management tool or any flow charting tool for that matter that supports the BPMN standard. A process definition is the map itself. When we create a process map in BizFlow, we call that the process definition. You can think of it as like a process template, just like you might have a Word template, and then that you might use for a policy, and then each of the individual policies would be what we would call the instances. Generally, in BizFlow, when you start a process, you are creating a running instance or an enactment of that process definition. And process archive is really just a completed process. So once a process ends, the flow is complete, it goes into an archive for historical and auditing purposes. The BizFlow Process Monitor, I showed you, it tracks the progression or flow of work. So when an instance is started, we can go to the BizFlow Process Monitor and we can track the progression or flow of that particular process, that given case or given instance of that process. Activity and work item. Activity refers to a given step in the process. And activities, if we go back to our process model, can be human activities, things that individuals do, or they can be system activities. A work item is generally associated with or is associated with a human activity, in that a work item is the item that is assigned to the individual or potentially group of individuals that are assigned to that activity. If I had an activity in my process that was for a group of users to approve something, Depending upon how I define that, if I want every member of that group to approve that item, there would be 6 work items created for that particular activity if there were 6 members in that group. So a work item is the individual assignment of a given activity. And work items, we find those work items in our work list or our inbox. And so each of these items is really a work item of a given activity. So if the activity is to, in this case, create the inquiry, there's one correlating work item because it's assigned to one individual, and that's to fill out the create inquiry form. So really it's a one-to-many. You have one activity and there can be one or more work items associated with that activity. The transition line, or what's also referred to in BPMN as the sequence flow, is the lines that connect one activity to another, and it in essence directs the flow of work through the process map or process model. The term participant refers to the assignee of a given work item, and that assignee could be a user, as we discussed, or a group of users. For example, often in times in BizFlow, you want to route work to a role group as opposed to an individual. That's very common to do. And so a participant of a process activity can be a user or group. Member in BizFlow is somewhat of a general term. A member could be a user, but a member could also be a group. And a member in BizFlow, you'll see when we talk about managing users and groups, generally have a profile in the system. So you could be a member of a group, or the group itself is considered a member. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a participant of anything. You could be a manager and belong to a manager group, but that doesn't necessarily mean work has been assigned to you as a participant. The work item handler, or we use the acronym, and you'll see this acronym a lot, WIH, is basically the container that holds or presents the form to the user. So let me spend a moment on this because it is a key concept in BizFlow. When you open up a given work item that's been assigned to you from your work list, the framework that surrounds that form, for example, the ability to attach documents or make discussions on this against this given form, is part of the work item handler. And the work item handler really handles the interaction between the user and what they're doing right now and the BizFlow process. They communicate with one another. When you design your form and you link it to a step in the process, you don't have to worry about completing that step or how BizFlow is going to move that item forward. You don't have to worry about how to set up any code or things associated with attaching documents or making comments. That functionality is present, it's already there. And all you need to do is create your form and link your form to the activity in the flow. And the handling of the work as it relates to the workflow is really done by this pre-built application that your form is running inside of. In BizFlow, we use the term application, and it's somewhat interchangeable with the word form, but applications can be things other than forms. On a given step or activity in the process, again, we'll go back to our model, we can associate applications to activities. And generally, we register applications in BizFlow. So in a given project, this appeals and grievance project, we have an application folder. And in that folder, we have various applications. Most cases, or typically, you're going to find forms. And those forms get associated to human types of activities. But there are also system activities that can be performed in BizFlow. And so you can also register with BizFlow other types of applications. So not just forms, but you can register web services, you can register URLs, EJBs, and other types of applications with BizFlow, and then incorporate those applications by linking them to activities within the process. And we'll talk a whole lot more about this later on in the course. And then the last term I wanted to reiterate was the term BizCove. If you remember, the user experience, the BizFlow web client, is made up of portlets, and a lot of systems will call them portlets. Some portals call them web parts like SharePoint, and in BizFlow they are called BizCoves, and they are the various components that make up the user experience or the user interface. And those BizCoves, there's a number of different types, and they are monitor, work list, initiation, report, and URL BizCove types, which make up, again, the ability to build the user experience or workspaces in BizFlow. The last thing I want to cover before we get into starting to build our process is just a little bit about the security model in BizFlow. It's not critical at this time that you completely understand all of the inner workings of this, and in the administrative course we go into this in a lot more detail, but it's helpful to understand the basic concepts when you're getting started with BizFlow. A member, and in this case a user, has a given license associated with their member profile, and licenses enable functionality. In BizFlow, there's different types of licenses. There's 4 types of licenses a user could have. They could either be a user, a designer, a general administrator, or a system administrator, and or all of the above. So a given user can have all 4 licenses associated with their member profile. Now, it's not typical for a member to have both a general administrator license and a system administrator license. Those are usually separated because of the type of functionality that those 2 types of licenses enable. Now, in order to control, however, various access, be that to functionality or content in BizFlow, we use 2 other types of characteristics that a member profile will have. A member will belong to 1 or more user groups, and user groups are used to either route work. So you could be a member of the finance group, and maybe we're routing work to the AP finance group for various invoice approvals. And they're also used for menu assignment. So when I want to create a given view into BizFlow, and if you remember, in our case management system we have an AG manager, and they have a certain view or menu into BizFlow. So we put that user into that AG manager group, and we can associate menus and views to those groups. And the second attribute or characteristic we assign to a user or a member in addition to their license is the authority group that they belong to. This authority not only grants access to functionality, it also is applied to folders in BizFlow, and then therefore provides permissions to different content really meaning being processes. So let me just kind of describe this maybe from a slightly different perspective. Let's say my member profile in BizFlow, I am a trainer, and I have all 4 licenses. So that entitles me to all of the functionality of BizFlow. However, the authority groups that I belong to are in essence going to enable that functionality. So while the license gives me rights to that functionality, the authority group grants that actual permission. And generally, there's a 1-to-1 relationship between the license and authorities in BizFlow. So if I'm a user and I have a user license, I'm therefore given a user authority group by default. These are the default authorities. But in addition to the default authorities in BizFlow, you can add your own custom authorities. In this case, I have also a custom authority called training, so I'm part of the training authority group. And that authority then is assigned to the training process folder in BizFlow, and it's also associated with the training user group. So I've granted this authority, this type of functionality, to this user group as well as to this folder. And so these are the interconnections between the license authority and user group. And again, in the administrative course, we go into a lot more detail in terms of how this works, but I wanted to just give you a very quick understanding of this as we begin to work on our processes. Okay, now we're finally ready and we can start to install the BizFlow Process Studio if you have not already done so.